Hello everyone, as always, I'm Vlad Sparastoria. I shoot and I know what I have to shoot. You might say Vlad Sparastoria, no. Another Mosin, yes, another Mosin, because this Mosin has an extremely important and interesting story to tell. Maybe for those who know them a little better, they already see a significant detail, which is the sight mount, definitely different from the usual one. But if we go and read the markings, we'll notice something very interesting. We'll see an inscription, Remington Armory, 1917. Did the Americans make this Mosin? Well, yes, not usually. We obviously associate the Mosin with Russia and the Soviet Union, and possibly with neighboring countries or satellites of Russia and the Soviet Union. However, World War I was, as you well know, a war of attrition. And very quickly, the various nations involved in that conflict realized that their reserves, as well as their weapon production capabilities, were nowhere near sufficient for the war effort. And Russia, a country that, especially at that time, was not industrialized but had large reserves of men, well, they didn't have enough Mosins to give to everyone. As you may recall, the Mosin was officially adopted in various versions in the 1800s. We told this story very well in a previous video. If you want, you can watch it by clicking in this corner. But in short, the very first Mosins were a long version, a dragoon version, and also a short carbine. And production was going rather slowly. The Russians themselves, Imperial Russia itself, had major problems putting the Mosin into production, which was their first weapon. Smokeless powder required a certain type of processing, for which the industry of Tsarist Russia was not entirely ready. The very first Mosins, believe it or not, were actually produced abroad. They are highly sought after by collectors. These are the ones made by the French. In fact, the French were the ones who produced the very first Mosins. And the Russian factories adapted to the necessary standards, actually buying machinery from France and the United States precisely to be able to produce these weapons. However, the war effort was enormous, so the Russians very quickly realized that they would need more weapons and other types of weapons. One solution was, for example, to give the old Berdan the Sun rifles to reserve units. Another solution was simply to buy other weapons from abroad, including ones in different calibers. Just think, the third most used weapon by the Russians would be the Japanese Aresaka rifle, which saw extensive use by Russian forces in World War I. However, they would also go on to buy weapons from commercial companies. They famously purchased the Winchester 1895, the lever-action rifle, and they would also buy from Remington in England and America. The Mosin. This contract for the production of Mosin rifles would begin in 1915, and initially, according to the first contract, Remington was supposed to produce 1,200 rifles. A huge quantity. The Americans set up production, basically did reverse engineering on this weapon, and started producing them. Production started off slowly, but then it suddenly accelerated. And by the end of the war, they built hundreds of thousands of these units, almost 1 million, but only a small minority of them actually ended up in Russia. There will be some initial deliveries of these weapons, however, as you well know, at the end of 1917. 17. In Russia, the Bolsheviks come to power. Power changes hands. And the Bolshevik thieves in government decide they have no intention of paying. The Americans were supposed to pay for these rifles officially, but they refused them because they were not of sufficient quality. That's a lie. It's absurd, because this is one of the best Mosins ever made in history. At that time, Remington was in serious financial danger when the Soviets refused to pay for these weapons because they had built hundreds of thousands of rifles. And one thing is clear. It's not 10 rifles, it's hundreds of thousands of rifles on a contract for 1,200,000. You understand? That's a very serious burden for a company. Well, the company was at such risk of bankruptcy because of this unfulfilled contract that the United States government stepped in. The United States government paid Remington to purchase these rifles. They would end up as property of the American government, which would use them in various ways. Some of these would end up with National Guard units, and others would be given to friendly allied nations. In particular, for example, a large number will be sent to Vladivostok to arm forces in the Russian Civil War. To arm, in particular, the Czechoslovak Legion, which was one of the main forces, let's say, capable of fighting. It was one of the centers of the counter-revolution in that area of Russia. The story of the Czechoslovak Legion itself is extremely interesting. But since they were in Russia and using a Russian caliber, they definitely came to appreciate the Mosin. Many other of these weapons ended up in other countries, like this one in particular, which ended up in Finland. An interesting thing about this Mosin is that it obviously has all the American markings, but also the Imperial Acceptance Mark. You can see the emblem, I repeat twice, of Nicholas II, of Tsar Nicholas II. It's beautiful. But for example, the wood is clearly Russian, so at some point it must have ended up over there. We don't know by whom, but it was repaired and restored with Russian wood. However, it also has an acceptance mark. This, is the typical Finnish mark. It means that at some point this weapon was taken by the Finns and fixed by the Finns. As you well know, or maybe you don't, Finnish Mosins are generally considered the very best. Many others will remain on the American civilian market. However, they will be bought by a private company. Many of them will be rechambered in 30-06 shortened and sporterized to be sold as hunting rifles. They are not very well regarded, but they still remain a rather interesting chapter in the history of firearms. Now, the Soviets falsely claimed that these were not quality weapons. But I, just by holding them and operating the action, notice a certain manufacturing precision, so I'm curious to see how it performs. Also because it's long. It's longer than the 9130, which is the Dragoon version. The 9130, so it's also a bit different in weight. But it also has the classic different sights, not like those on the 9130, so let's see if this nice rifle performs well. Unfortunately, we don't have the clip, but we'll load it by hand, the interrupter. You have to wrestle with it anyway, from what I see, okay? Do I have to be sure? Ah, okay, that's why it wouldn't go in. Let's see. So, in my opinion, the Soviets made the sights a bit better. They're just a bit more visible, and the Finns made them even better. From this point of view, then, this weapon is long. It's long and very heavy. Definitely, the shorter Mosins have less recoil up front, but they don't tend to tip forward on you. The action is surprisingly smooth for a Mosin, but you still feel it every time, especially on closing, where you still feel some resistance. The magazine interrupter, which, as we remember, is necessary for the proper functioning of the magazine. However, the interrupter itself moves smoothly. It's a thing of beauty. I don't know if it's more thanks to the Americans or the Finns, who, in any case, rebuilt them according to their own standards. However, these rifles operate quite smoothly. Don't get me wrong, it's still a Mosin, but honestly, if I had to have a Mosin for collecting, I'd want either this one or the French ones, the very first Mosins. Let's fire a few more shots. 3, 4, 4 e 5. Vai. The interrupter didn't work very well, and now the interrupter is actually holding the ammunition. That's an interesting malfunction, because I have to... There, now it's presenting the ammunition. Ah, what can I say? It's a really fascinating piece of history. It's nice because all the Mosins that are around aren't American Mosins. And again, just look at how beautiful it is. Nicholas II, the Russian eagle with the symbol 2 for Nicholas II. Tsarist Mosins definitely have their own charm. And an American Tsarist Mosin that ended up in Finland is even more fascinating. So, first of all, I want to thank the owner of this weapon very much for bringing it to me today so I could see it, touch it, have fun with it, and shoot it. Without people like you, this channel wouldn't be possible. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member or buying the t-shirts. It simply helps cover the shooting range costs, because you don't make that much with YouTube. If you want to support the channel for free, you can do something very important, which is to subscribe. Leaving a like and a comment helps the YouTube algorithm immensely, which really doesn't like firearms at all, because they're seen as something bad and evil. But look at how beautiful it is. Actually, let me tell you something. I'm going to do something extreme right now. This Mosin deserves a little kiss. That's all from me, and as always, I'll see you next time.